This program is presented by the Fromm Institute for Lifelong Learning at the University of San Francisco. The Fromm Institute, keeping up with the times, no matter when.
Now, let's just remind you where we are right now, is that last week, because I focused very much on that great signature achievement of Brahms, which was the First Symphony. This symphony that everybody had been waiting for 20 years, the one that Hans von Bülow called the 10th Symphony, because after the Beethoven 9 symphonies. The achievement of the Brahms First Symphony, it really was one of the greatest achievements of his career. And it put him not just on the map as a great European composer, he had already achieved that with the German Requiem, but now it put him in many people's minds on par with Beethoven. He was certainly the greatest symphonist in Germany after Beethoven, without question. So the thing is now, we are in the mid-1870s, and the question is, what now? Well, something I've noticed, I don't know if you have or not, but when you look at creative figures, when they reach the peak of their period like this, it has a tendency to be about a decade at the summit. Now, sometimes a little longer, but you think back, for example, to some of these other people. For example, Bach, for example, the 1720s when he went to Leipzig, that was the peak. That's when so many of his great works, the cantatas, the St. Matthew Passion, and so on. Mozart, the 1780s, when he moved to Vienna from 1782 to 1791. That's when Mozart was Mozart, you know. Beethoven, the aughts, essentially, from about the time of the Eroica, which is 1803, to the 8th Symphony in 1814. That was the time for him. And so what it was is now the 1870s through the late 1880s into the early 1890s this is going to be his golden time. And the nice thing with Brahms, though, is that once he hit that peak, he stayed on it. He did. It was a little longer for him than for many other composers, which is interesting because he didn't really live all that long. Brahms lived into his mid-60s. And so, yeah, he did. So therefore, he had this fairly long career. Now, one of the things I love about this, though, is that last week we were so focused on Brahms, the great serious symphonist, that we should always remember that Brahms was also a great lover of lighter music. He loved nothing more than Hungarian dances, gypsy songs, waltzes, glees, songs for choruses. He never lost that love. And that aspect of Brahms, I like to think of him as a cream puff. It's all crusty on the outside and soft and squishy on the inside, you know. This is a man who absolutely adored kittens and things like that, but he was terrified that anybody would see how kind-hearted he was. So he had a crusty exterior, but at the same time, we don't even know how many people he helped on the sly, how much money he sent to people without ever asking for repayment. He was the softest touch in Vienna, and he would often help people out very quietly without saying a word about it, and he never wanted it known. He had a lot of trouble accepting praise. When somebody tried to compliment him on his music, which happened a lot, he had a tendency to deflect it, and sometimes rather gruffly. So a lot of people thought he was a little bit of a creep. He wasn't. He was just very defensive like that. So it was an interesting thing, is that this great creator and this great composer was inside still a very sensitive, that young boy that we saw earlier on, very much so. So lighter music was always part of his output. And today, since we had such a heavy-duty class last week, today I want to look at a lot more lighter pieces for the most part. We're going to kind of have a little bit of fun Brahms today, although I'm not going to ignore the more serious stuff. We're doing the violin concerto today, you know. Yeah. So, the great beard finally happened. When was he going to do this, right? It happened around after the first symphony, late 1870s. Everybody's wondering, why did he do that? I mean, why do such beautiful human beings cover their face like this? Because he was, without question, the most handsome of all the great composers. Well, I have a feeling that he got really sick of people not really taking him seriously. When he was in his 40s, he looked like he was in his 20s still. He looked like a graduate student when he wrote the first symphony. And I think he got tired of getting kitschy cooed a lot, and all that. And he said something that sort of hinted at that. So the beard started happening, and also he lost his battle with middle-age girth. I can really relate to that. It all started happening, boing. And so he became Brahms, that with the beard and the rumpled clothes, because he hated to spend money on himself. He was a very frugal kind of person, so he wore the same old clothes and he'd get them patched up bit by bit. He had a flat at number 4 Karlgasse in Vienna, which he lived in for the rest of his life. It was a couple of rooms, and then eventually he bought out the landlady and he added another room. And he had a housekeeper who had 2 children of her own, and Brahms sort of took them in as his own. But he never went fancy. As a matter of fact, his housekeeper brought her furniture, and that's what he used. And yet, he was making money hand over fist. Brahms became a very wealthy man from his concerts and from publication and so on. So he never had to worry about money, but he didn't care. At one point, his publisher lost a great big, huge amount of money in a bad investment, and Brahms said, "Oh well, so what?" I mean, most of us would have been livid. It was like $100,000, equivalent, and yet he was, so okay, better luck next time. He just didn't care. So here he was. I'll talk more about his private life next week, what there is of it. But at this point, from the 1870s onward, he is the most boring composer there is when it comes to biography. Nothing happens. And so there's no more soap opera. So on. But it just doesn't. But we'll talk a little more about that next time. So there he is in full Brahmsianness. So there he is. He still had the cornflower blue eyes, though, and the hair still had some blonde left in it, even though it was gray by the time he was 50. Brahms is the earliest major composer of whom we have a recording. This is kind of cool, this one. It's a little bit like hearing Beethoven talk or something like this. Now, let me tell you the story of this. As I say, the Brahms cylinder, right, those early recording, Brahms voice and piano, maybe. Okay? Whether it's Brahms actually talking or not has been questioned. In my heart of hearts, I kind of think maybe the naysayers are right, but I don't want them to be right. I want this to be Brahms. And he does. I think it is. Here's what happened. It is the most famous recording ever made, and it was made on the 2nd of December, 1889. Wow. Edison had sent a representative around Europe to get people talking. For example, he got Gladstone, and so on, and he wanted to get people talking. So he spoke to Mr. Wangeman, and he plays the piano. On that very briefly. Of course, cylinders were this very primitive recording technology, of course, but still there it was. Now, it should be mentioned, is it really Brahms speaking? Alrighty, this is, some people think it might be the representative, but then again, we can't really tell. And so it's like so many things, like nobody really knows what's happening, so everybody has an opinion, is how that happens, right? But it's almost positive it's Brahms playing the piano at very least. And it's what his Hungarian dance number 1. Yum ba dum bum ba da yum ba dum bum ba da yum ba da dum ba dum bum. A lot of mistakes, a lot of boo-boos, and he wasn't practicing. He hadn't practiced for a decade, so it makes perfect sense to me that he'd butcher the thing, and so on like that. Now, the original cylinder was thought to have been lost for quite a while. Around the turn of the 20th century, Pate had made a flat version copy of it. And it was in terrible shape. The thing had been played too much, and those cylinders, they wore out very fast. And so it was mostly, but all you could ever hear on it. But the cylinder finally showed up again, and it was very badly damaged. It had rotted out quite a bit, and it couldn't be played. You put a needle on that thing, it would have shattered. They were made out of wax, remember. Wax gets brittle. So for a long time, that pate flat was the only thing we had. And everybody said, can you hear Brahms talking? And no. That's all you can hear. Well, technology to the rescue. Stanford has developed a system in which you can take these things and you can scan them three-dimensionally, right? Laser scanning, nothing ever touches the disk, instead just light. You make a three-dimensional scan of the thing, very high resolution, and from that scan you can take the grooves and use software to look at the grooves and reinterpret the waveform. Wow. Wow. And in the process, of course, you can take away obvious damage because there are all kinds of pits and, canyons, and it must be like the Grand Canyon inside that disc, right? And so on. And so they've been able to get more out of it than has ever been heard before. Now, it's still not very much. But you can hear him talk. He hated the fact that he had a high-pitched voice. This is what makes me think it's him, because this guy's got a high-pitched voice. Okay, so hang on. Here we go. Oh, you can barely tell. Just barely. But at the beginning, he says, hello, we think he says, hello, Dr. Edison, I'm Dr. Brahms, Johannes Brahms. We think that's what he's saying. There's some other people that say he's not saying that. But he does say Dr. Brahms, Dr. Johannes Brahms. He says that very clearly. You hear it? Yeah, that much. And that's a high-pitched voice. I think it's him. I think it's him. And the recording, and again, that's more than I'd ever heard of the piano recording before. They had to use a lot of, but yum, ba-dum, bum, ba-da-dum, ba-dum, bum. You can tell it's the first Hungarian dance. Cool. Among the very early recordings, by the way, of the world, the Incunabula, and so on, there's also a live performance of Handel's Israel in Egypt that they caught the year before this at the Crystal Palace. And again, the same kind of technology has been applied to it, and they can finally figure out what chorus it is that they're singing. So that's really something. It really is to be able to hear that. Well, it's too bad that we didn't get more from him. But there it is. The Academic Festival Overture is a product of this period, and there has never been a more joyous orchestral work written. I have a wonderful recording of it. This is our conductor, Pierre Monteux, who was the conductor of the San Francisco Symphony for a long time. He's the second longest serving San Francisco Symphony conductor. Michael Tilson Thomas now has the record. But Monteux was our conductor from 1935 through 1952. And he rescued a moribund orchestra and put it on the map. He was a major figure, of course, in the history of the symphony. That's why we call our donors program the Monteux Society, Pierre Monteux Society. And this is with the Vienna Philharmonic, and he recorded in 1962. I think he was 90-something when he did this. It was an amazing, I know, very long-lived guy. Now, here's how this happened. In 1879, the University of Breslau offered him an honorary degree, an honorary doctorate. Now, he had previously been offered one by Cambridge University, and he turned it down only because he had to go to England to accept it. And he could not make the trip, and the reason was he was deathly prone to seasickness. And he couldn't make the Channel crossing. He knew he'd never make it, or else he'd just be really, really sick. He was a baby. I mean, come on. I mean, it's just going to be a couple hours, puking, I suppose. But he just couldn't do it. So at any rate, he did not go, and they could not give him the doctorate without him actually going. But Breslau, he didn't have to get on a boat to go there. So what he did is he wrote this wonderful piece as a thank you gift. Wow, and so on. And what it is, it's a bunch of student songs, sort of things they might be singing in the taverns and out on the green or so on. And he combines them together into a great structure. It's classic sonata form structure, and with the most blingy orchestration he ever wrote. This is the only Brahms work with cymbals. It's got cymbals, bass drum, And we know that he's getting blingy because it's got triangle. And every time Brahms really goes for it, he does triangle. So that's so on. So he conducted the premiere himself. He was quite a good conductor when he was paying attention. Sometimes he did and sometimes he didn't. But 1881, he played the work. Now the cool thing about the Academic Festival Overture, which is truly a lighthearted, glorious piece of music, is that it's made up out of all of these songs, one after another. And he just uses them so well. You'll enjoy the piece more if you know what the songs are. So the first of them is the Rakushi March, which has been used by a lot of other composers as well. Here it is. Yum pa 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 ya pa 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 ya da dum bum ba da dum pa 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 pa. Okay, that's the Rakushi March. Then we have built a stately house. It sounds just a little bit like No Place Like Home. Da ya dun 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 dee, yum bum ba ya da dum bum bee. Then, the Father of Our Country. Ah, lovely. And it goes like this. That acts like a secondary theme. La da dum da ya da dum bum ba da dee da da. And then this fun one, mostly known as the Fox Hunt. It comes from afar. This is a wonderful, quick, spiky little tune, and it goes like this. Okay? And then he ends the thing in the great drinking song, Let Us Be Merry, Gaudiamo Sigitur, and you probably know that just fine. It goes like this. He pulls out all the stops for that when he gets to it, and so on. So for my chart for this, rather than doing the usual, I thought the best thing is just give you labels showing you what tune's going on. So it's a chart that just has all these little panels that light up when it's the tune. Okay? There are going to be spots where nothing's much lit up. That's because it's developmental stuff and, transitions and, boring stuff like that, But for the most part, this is the least boring piece he ever wrote. I have to tell you that there's nothing at the beginning that quite gives you an idea what it's going to be. He plays it cool. Because right at the beginning, it could be serious, it could be, and then it all starts happening. Transition. March. trumpets, no less. Down a little bit, made more smooth. Kind of mixing things together a little bit. boy! Isn't that fun? It sounds a little bit like the overture to Der Meistersinger, the Wagner, and I don't think that's coincidence. Marvelous stuff, isn't it? That's the Vienna Philharmonic at one of the great peak periods, by the way. This is the same time when they did that wonderful Ring Cycle recording with Schulte. Same period. So it's one of the greatest of all orchestras at one of their greatest peak periods. Wonderful stuff. Well, Brahms, oh boy, he loved waltzes, he loved Hungarian dances, he loved gypsy songs, and in the years flanking the First Symphony, he wrote what has to be the most delectable and imperishable set of waltzes any human being's ever written. They're unusual in that they are written for piano four hands, that's two people at one piano, and vocal quartet. He called them the love song waltzes. The Liebeslieder waltzes. And boy, talk about Olympian performers. Look at the vocalist alone. Heather Harper, Dame Janet Baker, Peter Pears, and Thomas Hemsley. And look at the piano. Benjamin Britten himself with Claudio Abreu, who was a good, and this is live. This is at the Aldeboro Festival. It's a fantastic performance, as you can only imagine these people doing. The inspiration appears to have been Schubert. Schubert wrote a lot of waltzes, and Brahms was doing an edition of Schubert waltzes. He was a great champion of Brahms's work. And so I think it's probably all those enchanting Schubert waltzes that had inspired so many other composers. Liszt, for example, wrote a whole set of the evenings in Vienna that are this. And I think that's what really inspired him. They were immensely popular from the beginning and have remained so ever since. No more ingratiating or wonderful music has ever been written, I think. The first set are from before the First Symphony, and they are sets of a collection called Polidora. I'm only going to give you the titles of them and not worry about the lyrics, because the lyrics are the usual. I love you, I love you. You know, my life's a mess since I met you. I can only think of you. And on the banks of the Danube we met and we fell in love. La-da. So it's, you know, they're fine, but the important part is the music. It says it all. They could almost be singing solfege syllables, really. For all it's worth. So he wrote another set later on, the new love song waltzes. They were just as big of a hit as the first ones were, and he always mentions that the vocal parts are optional. The words are fine, they're beautifully set, but again, it's all in the music, really. But almost nobody ever does it without them. I mean, for one thing, singers start sending them tarantulas in the mail if they don't. You know, it's just very important. And when you hear them perform this well, you can understand why you've got to have the voices. You've got to. You simply do. So we're going to hear four of them. I've taken a selection of four of them in a loving, insightful, from Olympian performers. And I mean, good heavens, it doesn't get any better than this. Recorded live at Aldeboro by Decca, one of the great recording companies. So this is a very fine. You can hear a little bit of audience noise, but not much. Who would make noise in the audience when you got these people performing for you? Wow. Here we go.
Mit dem Blicke, diese Wille
Janet Baker at her peak. Schön. You know, it seems like the waltz was barely born, but before it became nostalgic. It's sort of the perfect vehicle for a kind of wonderful nostalgia. There's a nostalgic feel to those. And those are all being written right at the same time that the Waltz King is busy writing the beautiful Blue Danube and all that, which Brahms, by the way, was a big fan of those pieces. And Johann Strauss Jr. was a very good friend of his. And he stayed at the Strauss home any number of times. And once he signed a card to Mrs. Strauss, Frau Strauss, and he scribbled down the first few bars of the Blue Danube Waltz. And he said, "Unfortunately not by Johannes Brahms." I love that. But every time Brahms writes waltzes, they always seem to be imbued with a certain nostalgic quality to it. And even in an earlier, slightly earlier set of waltzes, which he wrote for solo piano, there's this marvelous feeling of this sweet nostalgia. At least that's how I think of them. So when I play this particular waltz in E major, which is one of my absolute favorite encore pieces, I never can resist the temptation to wax a little nostalgic. So there are two primary versions of the piano waltzes, solo piano waltzes. There's one for piano four hands and one for piano solo. They were so popular that, in fact, he had his publisher put out simplified versions of both. So you got 4 versions of these things. Basically, it's just basically a version for everybody. As long as you can get kind of thump or piddle a little bit on the piano, you've got a version of these for you. I'm playing the original version. I'm not using the easy one here. But it's not hard. I mean, these are not difficult pieces to play, except they can make you sound like an absolute peasant if you don't play them right. In other words, they're the kind of pieces, they're very easy physically, and they're bombshells waiting to blow up the inattentive pianist. Play them exactly the way they're written, you're dead. So, I think I caught that in this performance. Maybe. This is a particularly wonderful piece. I've just loved it for years, and I trot it out as an encore piece whenever I get a chance, and I've got a chance, so I'm going to trot it out. This is the Waltz in E major by Johannes Brahms. Yeah, thank you. The ideal encore piece, I have to tell you. It really is. A lot of this wonderful lighter Brahms out there, tons of it. And let us not forget, he is the ranking composer of art song, Lieder, the lead of the later 19th century. The great art songs, the great German art songs, are really the work of 3 big composers. Schubert at the beginning, Schumann there in the middle, and Brahms there at the end. There are other art song composers, but those are the 3 titans. Brahms's art songs are generally not performed by singers as often as Schubert and Schumann, and I think part of it is because his choice of texts tends to be either songs about the contentment of love or its despair. but there's not the kind of range. For example, Schumann, who set Heine, and Schubert, who set Goethe. Brahms has a tendency to use this text very well, but you can tell that for him, and a lot of times the words really serve the music. And so very much a musician first, word guy second, whereas Schumann was word guy first, musician second. That doesn't lessen them anyway. I'm just telling you why singers don't perform them as often. Also, like that waltz I just played, they can make a monkey out of the inattentive singer. Schubert and Schumann are a lot safer. They protect you some. Brahms never does. So the fact is, only the very finest of musicianly singers are interested in this music. But the ones who are fabulous at it. And no one's better than Herr Thomas Quasthoff. Now, I don't know if you know his story a little bit. He was a thalidomide baby. Remember that problem? And he doesn't. His arms are only flippers, and it's like so. But he did not let that stop him, and he's had a brilliant career. He's retired pretty much now, as a leader singer. But he also did some opera, and he's at one of his most moving performances was pretty recently. It's on video. Is the St. Matthew Passion that the Berlin Philharmonic and Rattle did? That's done as kind of semi-staged version. It's not at all at all crass. It's beautifully done. And at one point, he sings one of the great arias. He sings Makadish, and it's unbelievably moving. The way he does it. The man just fantastic voice and a fantastic musical sensibility. Now, the piece is written, I'm going to be a little tiny theory lesson here, just a tiny one, is written in what we call three-part song form, or small ternary is another word for it. It's a three-part form, very simple, in which you have a first phrase, which is usually made up out of a couple of short phrases, a second passage, which is a little bit more transitory, and then a back to the original idea with some modifications. So it's very, very common kind of form. Now, the chart I have of this is quite a bit more technical than the ones I usually use here, because this is one from my conservatory class. So for those who would like to look at a little bit more nitty-gritty on one of these, for one thing, it's got the music notation on it. And I almost never do that because I do not assume that you can read music, but I know quite a few of you can. It also uses a lot of technical terms. It lists the cadence types. It'll say things like pack, which means perfect authentic cadence, or hook, which means half cadence. And it'll say things like parallel period by contour, and you go, whoa, don't worry about it, okay? Don't worry about it. It's mostly for theory classes to explain how these things are written, so don't be scared by it, okay? So for parallel period by transposition ending on HC, whoa, antecedent, and so on. Don't worry about any of this. Just enjoy the music. And there is the text on the bottom. "O cool forest in which my darling walks, where do you murmur, echo," and so on. It's nature painting. And the beautiful, beautiful song, look at the vocal line. You don't have to read music to see. Ya-dee-da-da-da-dee, ya-da-da-da-dee. It's almost like a folk song. It's very, very simple, very simple. The middle section, which starts at bar 11, la-dee-da-dee-ya, goes off harmonically into a funny place, very short, and then he goes back to the end. So again, short, sweet, to the point, and there's a handful of composers in the history of the world who could pull something like this off successfully. Here we go. Section goes far afield. It's pure artistry. I can tell you as a performer, absolutely pure artistry, and it doesn't call attention to itself. He just sounds comfortable singing it. But if you hear this sung by somebody who doesn't really know what they're doing, like they bring an operatic bling to it, completely. Imagine what a big vibrato would do to this. Or operatic scoopiness. What that would do to it. Or an insensitive pianist kind of going, whack, 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 like that. When you realize everything they have to do to make this work, again, you realize why you don't hear these done well that often. But fortunately, they can be done well by these wonderful singers, such as the incomparable Ellie Ameling Dutch. Now, I'm going to go just the other direction on this particular song. This is a little later. You can see Opus 105. It was published later, but it's similar period. And I'm going the other direction here, and I'm doing a non-chart. All I'm going to do is give you the words and let you go to it. Now, this is a great example of Brahms writing in a very simple folk song style in many ways. This is what we call, this is a very simple, it's called strophic, which it's just like a hymn if you've ever sung one in church. It's a paragraph of text, that is a stanza, just repeated a few times with new words, but the same music. So the same music 3 times, but the text changes each time. All Brahms does with it is he does a little tiny transition between the stanzas, and he repeats the last line of each stanza. Total simplicity. Absolutely pure vocal line. Simple piano writing. Again, it means this is the hardest stuff to do well. It's like a seamstress will tell you the hardest thing to make is a simple black dress because everything has to be right. All right? Roasting a chicken, that's really hard. That's what this is. So, the words, it seems as though melodies pass softly through my mind, as though spring flowers bloom and there's fragrance in the air. That's a stanza. And then when one would seize this in words and make it visible, it pales like a gray mist. And yet there remains in poetry a deeply hidden essence that gently from some quiet inner source brings tears to the eyes. Lovely sentiment, a lovely idea. And the music, the music. She could be singing solfege syllables, and it would be just as effective. But the words really help. Here we go. Now repeat. That. Transition. Repeat the last line. Transition. And stanza. Now 2 lines repeated at the end. Perfection in about 2 minutes of music. By the way, I don't know how well you know this, but that ending thing in the piano could have been written by Robert Schumann. It's just a marvelous evocation of his great mentor and so on. This song could almost be a Schumann. Almost. The melody's a little more Brahmsian, but still it almost could be. Well, before we take our break, I just want to introduce, and then because I give them a little chance to clear, we are going to do a great big piece. As a matter of fact, we're going to do two of them. And the great big piece we're going to do is the violin concerto. Yep. This is among the three great monarchs of violin concertos. The first is the Beethoven, the second is the Mendelssohn, and this is the third. He wrote it for Joachim, of course, his dear friend. Off and on, I mean, the friendship was very rocky, but it never faltered musically. It is a symphonic concerto. It almost could be a symphony in many ways. It certainly opens like one. It is in stark contrast to so many of the more popular violin concertos, the Paganinis, where they're fun, the Viottis, the Vieuxtemps, things like that. It's stark contrast to that. This is a violin concerto without any bling at all, and so on. Joachim worked very closely with Brahms on it. Brahms was a pianist. He was not a violinist. He knew the instrument well enough, but when it comes to writing a concerto, you need expert help if it's not your instrument, because a concerto is about the instrument. So Joachim worked very closely with him, which means, of course, they fought like tigers all the time and so on about it. But Joachim actually wrote the first movement cadenza. It's his. It's his. And this is not some concerto where you make up some trashy cadenza. It simply is not. It is not. It may be ranked in the top tier now, but it had a long path to acceptance. People didn't like it when it came out. They wanted lighter. Concertos are supposed to be toe tappers. They're supposed to be fun. They're supposed to be full of spectacular, cool effects. And a violin concerto is supposed to be clouds of rosin and strings breaking and sweat flying and all that. And this thing is actually harder than any of those concertos, but it doesn't sound like it. That's the problem. And in fact, it was pretty much ignored until Fritz Kreisler came along, the great violinist, and he made us some recordings of it. The 1920s recordings that he made in the early 30s, they're gorgeous. And that's pretty much what made it repertory at that point. But it took that long. It took a full generation before people caught up to this great concerto. It has never looked back, of course. Now, I'll give you a few little tips, then we'll go into the full thing. To begin with, like so many great Brahms works, Brahms generates everything out of a few seed ideas. Brahms may be challenging that way, but he's always fair. And that's the first thing you hear are those seed ideas. It's the very first thing, and what you hear are a bunch of thirds. Ya-dee-dum, bim-bum. That's what he's going to generate the whole piece out of, is this. Goes upside down, goes back down, and it finishes. La, 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 loo. For example, when the violin comes in, that's what the violin plays. But it's been transformed. But it's the same tune. Wow. Yes, but of course, in case you missed that, which you just might, that is the same tune, he let you in on it just a few measures later. Yeah, thank you. So I'll leave this to you on your break. I just want to tell you that one of the biggest problems any concerto writer ever faces is balance. That's true in a piano concerto. And pianos are big, heavy things. Violins, big, right? And there's a whole bunch more of them in the orchestra. So what's a single violin going to do? I mean, you're not going to mic them or something, put a microphone on them. It's like a mouse taking on a Sherman tank, right? This poor violin doing this, and if the composer hasn't done his or her job right, you've got this poor violinist doing all this, and you can't hear a thing, because the whole orchestra is just blasting them out. They might as well just go home, for all the good they're doing. And so a composer has to be aware of this. How can I make this concerto possible? Because if you don't make it possible for the soloist to be heard, nobody's going to play the thing. I mean, why go to all the work to play that when you might... Right? Why bother? And so on. So after our break, which is now, we will discuss how he solved the problem. Because he did. Brilliantly. Alrighty, I would like to have you back at 11:08 and 13 and a half seconds. Thank you. All right. Brahms writing a violin concerto and facing this difficulty. How do you make it work? Well, this is the first way. Put the violin 10 miles above everybody else. Way up high. Right? We can always hear a little kid's voice out in the midst of a crowd. You can always hear the violin up high. But you can't always do that. I mean, the poor violinist is playing on about that much string, when they're doing that, right? Intonation is very difficult that way. So another way is to have the violinist play 2 strings instead of 1. It's called double stops. It's physically difficult but very doable. And here's a particularly wonderful passage in the first movement where he shows you how to make a violin sound like a whole army of violins. Wow. You have to eat your Wheaties to do that, right? And so on. Okay. Another is the old ritornello style, which is the concerto as tennis match. The violin here, orchestra there, and you go bop, 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 and sometimes you go bop and bop like that. But it's this sort of back and forth. The two almost never play together. So that's how you avoid it, right? You don't get run over by the tank if you don't get anywhere near the tank. And so that's one way to do it. Here's a really great passage in the first movement where you start with a quick tennis match and then the orchestra just takes over the joint. Violin doesn't have a chance against that, all right? So on. Now, one of the, I think, as I told you, one of the reasons this didn't get accepted was because violinists didn't really like it. But what they really didn't like was the slow movement. The reason they didn't like it is because it's got this ravishingly great tune, and Brahms gave it to the oboe. Yeah, but what a great choice it was. It was just right. Well, let's hear it a little bit. This is a very rare recording. Unless you were at the symphony 2 seasons ago when I played it for a talk, nobody else has heard this because it's been locked up in an archive and for a long time. But this is the second and third movement of the concerto in 1949. Standard hour broadcast, San Francisco Symphony. It was master Noam Blinder. Conductor was Pierre Monteux. And our principal oboist, I didn't put his name up here. His name was Merrill Remington. And here he is playing that gorgeous solo. It's a very scratchy recording. It's an off-air, dub, right, on a great big 78. Doesn't matter. Beautiful playing. Merrill had a very sort of pungent oboe sound, very French. And it's the characteristic sound of the San Francisco Symphony in this particular era. Nobody else had quite that pungent of an oboist. And so it remained our signature sound until the Cripps era. And then Merrill finally retired during Joseph Cripps' time. He had deteriorated some by then. I have to admit that when I did the Symphony podcast for our centennial, on one of them, when I think it was the 11th one, was on our soloists. And I traced Merrill playing the same passage in a Brahms symphony throughout his career. And you do hear the guy deteriorate. And I thought, this is kind of mean, isn't it? But it's still, at the same time, he was still playing quite beautifully musically, even in 1964, I think was his last one. But he was there for a long time. Marvelous player. Now, for the last movement, Brahms did write a more virtuosic thing. It's a kind of a gypsy rondo in a sense like that. But, like all of Brahms' music, it is rock solid in its integrity. There is not one note in this thing that is there by chance. Everything comes out of what he gets out of the very opening tune, and not surprisingly, that opening tune is built on exactly the same materials as the first movement. Waste not, want not. Use a couple of simple things. So, we begin with the melodic materials, and the main theme of the movement is in thirds. It's in thirds, and it's double stops in the violin. I can tell you that many violinists really hurt my ears when they play this because it gets way out of tune, but not Isaac Stern. Yes? Double stop means two strings at the same time. So the bow is, the question was, what is it? The bow strikes two strings, because you can do two strings with a bow, and that's not the hard part. Hard part's up here with your left hand. Right? So it just makes my fingers hurt thinking about it. All right? Here we go. That's how it starts. Okay? And that idea, ya-da-dee-da, it's tracing a third. Ya-da-dum, 1, 2, 3, ya-da-da-dee, ya-da-da-da. And the notes, the double stop notes are a third apart. So it's thirds this way, and it's thirds that way. Thirds, 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 everywhere. That's how he does it. Now, this is a rondo, which means that it's got a reprise that comes back from time to time. And between the reprises, there are episodes, sometimes also known as excursions. And each of the excursions has its own theme. Well, Brahms keeps the idea of the double stop going in this. So it's double stops, but now it's in octaves. So like that, they're much easier to do on the violin than on the piano, but they're still hard. And it's an upward scale. And it goes like this. Listen to it again, and you'll hear the orchestra is going down while the violin is going up. That's Brahms, the classicist, talking. You see? Like that. Very cool. But in case we forget about those thirds, Brahms makes sure we don't. And he writes this little cadential figure. A cadence is what stops things. It's the ending figures. Well, his cadential figures, which come generally at the end of each episode, and they lead right back into the reprise, even the dog can tell that this is the motivic idea, because it is third, 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 third. It's like he's saying, do you understand? I'm building this piece out of thirds. Get it, get it, get it. That's what he does. And so you hear these thirds. Da-da, da-da, da-da. It's like, oh, do you think there's some thirds in here? Yeah, it's almost to the point of being overdone. But of course, he never quite goes that far, right? Ever. Now, we also have the second episode, which is like our lyrical thing, right? Because it's a very burly movement, right? Well, Brahms. How much you want to bet that second thing is going to be built out of thirds, and that they're going to go down? They've been going up so much, right? That's exactly what happens. La da dee 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 da da. Now, how careful attention were you paying before the break when I played the opening theme of the first movement that goes da ya ta ti ti? This goes ya ta ti ta ti. The resemblance is not accidental. da da dee dee. And then orchestra comes in. Thirds. Do 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 do. Da dee dee. Ba dee 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 dee. Ba dee dun dun dee. Ba da dee dun dun. So in other words, he's pulling that material back in. We get another big reprise. We get some cadenzas. There's 2 short cadenzas. They're both written out, and you must play them the way they're written. No improvising in this piece. And they're both very, very short because he gets to the end of this, and he writes a coda. Now, one thing Brahms was so good at doing is when he writes a coda, the little extra ending, is taking his original materials, using them again, but transforming them just enough. And what he does is he goes from what is called simple meter, that's meter that divvies up 1 and 2 and 1 and da 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 ba 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 ba, and making it compound. In which case it goes 1 and 2 and 1 and 2 and like we're off to see the wizard, the wonderful wizard. That's compound meter. Yappa 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 pa. So he takes ya pa 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 simple and ya yappa pa yappa pa 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 pa. It gets all horsey, in other words, at the end like that. And so it gets all gallopy and fun. Hi-ho, tally-ho. Right, get up. Right. Yeah. That's what he does. La 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 la. It's all thirds going down. He brings back the episode themes, of course. Bum ba-dum ba-da ba-dum bum ba ba-dum ba-da ba-dum bum bum. Right at the end, he has to finish it, right? He's going to do some repeated chords. Want to guess how many there are? 3. Right to the very last moment. Music of integrity. So here we go with a nice formal chart of the thing with quite a bit of detail. You'll be glad to know this. My undergraduates at Cal also get introduced to this concerto using this self-same chart. So. Contrasting phrase. And back. Orchestra. Transition. Bridge between parts. These fast scales get us ready for the episode. Now. Takes it over. There comes that cadence. Da-da, third. And go. Notice it's shortened. Do not wear out your welcome in a rondo. So. And it starts to dissolve. Transition built on the main material. Of course. now, middle episode. Downward. Orchestra comes in. Thirds. Now, we're going to do the episode again. Okay? Here it comes. Dun, da, 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 da. Orchestra. Orchestra takes it. Here comes that cadence theme again. Da da dee da dee. Now, listen to what he does to avoid being predictable. Here goes. Right in the middle of it. Smart. Because then the orchestra comes back. Great return. Cadenza. Short, to the point. Orchestra's already there. Trills. Orchestra's playing the main theme. Ba-ba-ba-bum. Listen to the way orchestra goes. Bum, ba 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 bum, ba 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 bum, ba 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 bum, ba ba bum. In a lesser composer, this would be a big cadenza. Not this guy. And that, my friends, is it. Tally ho. Reference to the episodes. Main thing. B again. Okay, and sell it. Here we go. But he lets it die down. Magnificent concerto in a really good performance. I got to tell you, a lot of violinists sound very shrill in this last movement. It's very hard to play without forcing. One of the great memories of my student years, or a little after, was at the conservatory. Way back when, we were out on 19th Avenue, right? Well, our student orchestra was being conducted by John Adams, who was not famous. He wasn't famous yet. He was just our teacher. He was just Goofy John, he's our theory teacher. Looked just like Alfred E. Newman on the Mad magazine, and all that. And he was like 5 years older than we were, so anyway, fun. We always liked him. He was great. You went to parties, in his house and all that. Anyway, the violinist was our head of our violin faculty in those days. Her name was Camilla Wicks. She was a great Norwegian violinist. She's one of those great violinists that all the violinists know, but the public generally doesn't. She was like a Joachim on the violin. And she... she played like a goddess. And the slow movement in particular was just, I just sitting there like... and then they got into this, and I still remember her leaping off the stage to start this thing. Little bitty woman about that big, and like this and all that. But no harshness, no nothing. And John with her every split second. John's a really good conductor and all that. And our orchestra they were all inspired too. They were all jazzed by this. So they were all playing like a little Vienna Philharmonic themselves, and so on. I mean, it's pretty obvious for once that actually practiced their parts. That was really cool. So it was just one of those incredible evenings. It really was. And this piece tends to produce those. I don't know if you heard Anne-Sophie Mutter play it a couple of seasons ago with the symphony. Just incredible. So most of the time, violinists really do rise to the challenge of this piece. Every once in a while, one of them gets all athletic with it, and that ruins it. But not too often. Well, I was planning on going on to the Second Symphony, but no. You got to have your lunch, and I'm going to get back out to the Delta and all that. So we're going to defer the Second Symphony for the beginning of the next class so I can do it justice. Because after all, what a pip of a symphony is the Brahms Second in D major, same key as the violin concerto, in fact. So that's where we're going to start next week, is in the glorious sunlit world of the Brahms Second Symphony. We'll move on from there. All right. Have a great week. Thank you. Have a great week.